The combination lock on my locker wouldn't turn. My fingers were so numb from cold and exhaustion that they felt like clumsy sausages attached to my hands, refusing to cooperate with the simple brain command to twist right, then left, then right again. It took 3 tries before the mechanism finally clicked open with a metallic snap that echoed too loudly in the empty changing room. I stood there for a moment, forehead resting against the cool metal of the locker door, just breathing. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The breathing exercise was something I taught my patients when they were spiraling into panic. But lately, I was the one who needed it the most. 16 hours. I had been on my feet for 16 hours straight, covering a double shift because rent was due in 3 days and my bank account was sitting at a terrifying $42. I pulled my coat off the hook, catching a glimpse of myself in the small, cracked mirror taped to the inside of the door. I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her skin was the color of old parchment, translucent and gray. There were dark bruises of fatigue under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide anymore. She looked hollowed out, like someone had reached inside and scooped out all the light, leaving only a shell behind. I quickly looked away, shutting the locker door with a trembling hand. I didn't want to look at her. I didn't want to admit that at 26 years old, I looked like I was waiting to die. My stomach gave a violent, painful twist, a reminder that I hadn't eaten anything since a half a bagel at 6 in the morning. That was over 14 hours ago. I had spent my lunch break sleeping in the supply closet because the exhaustion was louder than the hunger, and I had spent my dinner break charting patient files to pick up overtime. I grabbed my bag, the strap digging into my shoulder blade where the bone felt too sharp against the skin. I knew I had lost weight. I could feel it in the way my jeans hung loose on my hips, in the way my rings spun on my fingers. But food costs money, and keeping the lights on in the apartment cost money, and keeping Brad happy costs the most money of all. Brad. Just the thought of his name made my heart hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I checked my phone, dread pooling in my gut. No new messages. That could mean he was asleep. Or it could mean he was sitting in the dark of our living room, nursing a bottle of whiskey and waiting for the sound of my key in the lock. Going home used to be the best part of my day. Now, the subway ride to the Bronx felt like a funeral procession. My apartment wasn't a home anymore. It was a cage. A cage where the rules changed every single day, and the punishment for breaking them was always physical. I walked out of the hospital doors, and the wind hit me like a physical blow. It was November in New York, that miserable time of year when the rain felt more like ice shards than water. I pulled my thin coat tighter around me, burying my chin in my scarf. I should have taken a cab. Any sane person working this late would have taken a cab, but a cab to the Bronx would cost $35, and that was $35 I didn't have. So I walked. The streets were slick with black rain, reflecting the neon lights of the city like a distorted oil painting. I kept my head down, moving automatically, one foot in front of the other. Just keep moving. If I stopped, I wasn't sure I would have the strength to start again. By the time I reached the subway station, I was soaked through. My shoes squelched with every step, the cold water seeping into my socks and freezing my toes. I swiped my Metro card, praying it still had a balance. The turnstile clicked, allowing me through, and I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The platform was crowded, smelling of wet wool, stale ozone, and the distinct metallic scent of the underground. It was rush hour for the night shift workers, the cleaners, the exhausted souls who kept the city running while the bankers and lawyers slept in their high-rise condos. I found a spot near a concrete pillar and leaned against it, trying to take the weight off my legs. The wait for the train felt like an eternity. Every minute that ticked by was another minute closer to Brad. I started bargaining with the universe in my head. Please let him be asleep. Please let the whiskey have knocked him out. If he's asleep, I can sneak in, lock the bathroom door, and sleep in the tub. I'll be safe in the tub. The rumble of the approaching train vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The lights of the tunnel brightened, and the train screeched into the station, a deafening metal-on-metal shriek that made my head spin. I pushed my way into the car, squeezed between a man in a damp construction vest and a woman clutching a wet umbrella. There were no seats. Of course there were no seats. I reached up and wrapped my hand around the overhead rail, gripping it tight. The doors chimed and slid shut. The train lurched forward. That was when the world tilted. It started as a buzzing in my ears, like a swarm of bees getting closer. Then the edges of my vision began to blur, turning soft and gray. The heat in the car was suffocating, a thick, humid soup of too many bodies and wet clothes. I felt sweat prickle on my forehead, cold and clammy, contrasting sharply with the heat. "Breathe, Clara," I told myself. "Just breathe. You are a nurse. You know what this is. Hypoglycemia. Exhaustion. Just hold on for 6 stops." I tried to focus on the advertisements above the windows. A lawyer promising to get you money for your injury. A cosmetic surgeon promising a new nose. The words started to swim, rearranging themselves into nonsense. My stomach rolled, a wave of nausea rising up my throat. I swallowed hard, closing my eyes for just a second to stop the spinning. Bad idea. Without the visual anchor, the spinning got worse. My knees felt like they were made of water. I realized with a detached sort of horror that my hand was slipping from the rail. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. "I'm going down," I thought. The realization was strangely calm. I'm going to fall on this dirty floor and everyone is going to stare. My grip failed. My legs gave out. I slumped forward, gravity taking over. But I didn't hit the floor. I didn't feel the hard, grimy impact I was expecting. Instead, I collided with something solid, something warm. Strong arms wrapped around me, halting my descent with jarring suddenness. I was pulled against a chest that felt like a stone wall, hard and unyielding. For a moment, everything was confusion. I blinked, trying to clear the gray fog from my eyes. My cheek was pressed against fabric fine, expensive wool that smelled of cedar, rain, and something darker, like musk and power. It was the best thing I had ever smelled. It smelled like safety. I heard a voice, low and deep, vibrating right against my ear. It wasn't asking if I was okay. It was commanding me to breathe. I tried to push myself up, tried to apologize, to say I was fine, just tired. But my body refused to obey. I was limp, a rag doll in this stranger's arms. The train swayed as it took a curve, and the man shifted his stance to keep us both upright. He didn't stumble. He didn't even sway. He just widened his stance and held me tighter, anchoring us both against the chaos of the moving train. I finally managed to lift my head enough to look at him. He was terrifying. That was my first coherent thought. He had a face carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard lines. His hair was dark, wet from the rain, swept back from a forehead that was currently furrowed in a frown. But it was his eyes that held me. They were dark, almost black, and they were scanning my face with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. He wasn't looking at me like a nuisance. He was looking at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. He asked me if I could hear him. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the noise of the tracks, but distinct. I managed a weak nod. I tried to stand on my own, embarrassed by my weakness, humiliated that I had collapsed in the arms of a stranger who looked like he owned the entire city. As I tried to pull away, his grip on my arm shifted, and that was when disaster struck. My coat had fallen open. The sleeve of my scrub top had ridden up during the fall, bunching above my elbow. I felt the cool air of the subway car hit the skin of my upper arm, and I felt his gaze drop. Time seemed to stop. The noise of the train faded into the background, leaving only the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. I knew what he was looking at. I knew what was painted on my skin in ugly shades of yellow, green, and purple. Handprints, finger marks. The souvenir Brad had left me 3 nights ago when he grabbed me and shook me until my teeth rattled because I had bought the wrong brand of coffee. I tried to yank my arm back, panic flaring hot and bright in my chest. Shame washed over me. A tidal wave of it. I didn't want him to see. I didn't want anyone to see. But his grip was iron. He didn't let go. I watched his face change. The clinical concern vanished, replaced instantly by something much darker. His eyes narrowed. His jaw clenched so hard I saw a muscle jump in his cheek. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. It wasn't disgust I saw in his face. It was rage. Pure, cold, lethal rage. He looked from the bruises back to my face. His eyes searched mine, looking for the lie I was about to tell. I opened my mouth to say the script I had rehearsed 1,000 times. I fell. I bumped into a door. I'm clumsy. But the look in his eyes silenced me. He wasn't going to believe me. He knew. He looked like a man who knew exactly what violence looked like, and exactly what kind of force it took to leave marks like that on a woman's arm. He spoke then. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He leaned in close, his lips brushing my ear, creating an intimacy that should have been invasive, but instead felt protective. He asked me who did this. It wasn't a question. It was an interrogation. It was a vow. I stared at him, my mouth trembling. I couldn't speak. I couldn't say Brad's name. Saying his name made him real, summoned him like a demon. The stranger didn't press for a name. He just held my gaze, his eyes promising retribution for a crime he hadn't even witnessed. He shifted his grip, pulling me closer, shielding my arm from the view of the other passengers. He told me I wasn't going home tonight. Panic spiked again. I whispered that I had to, that I couldn't go with him, that I didn't know him. He ignored me. He looked over my head and signaled to someone behind me. Another man appeared, huge, silent, wearing a raincoat that couldn't hide the bulk of his shoulders. The stranger gave a single, sharp nod. The train began to slow for the next station. The stranger scooped me up. He didn't help me walk. He literally picked me up, cradling me against his chest as if I weighed nothing more than a child. I protested weakly, hitting his chest with a fist that had no strength behind it. I told him he couldn't do this. I told him I had work in the morning. He told me to sleep. He said he had me. The doors opened, and he carried me out into the cold night air. The rain was still falling, but I didn't feel it. He was shielding me, his body acting as a barrier between me and the storm. We moved toward a waiting black SUV that was idling at the curb, looking menacing and sleek. The large man opened the back door, and the stranger slid inside with me, never once loosening his hold. As the heavy door thudded shut, sealing out the noise of the city, the warmth of the car enveloped me. The smell of leather and cedar was overwhelming now. My eyes felt heavy, too heavy to keep open. The last thing I saw before the darkness finally claimed me was the stranger's hand resting gently over the bruises on my arm. Not squeezing, just covering them, covering the shame. He whispered into the silence of the car. He said that nobody would ever touch me like that again. And for the first time in years, as I slipped into unconsciousness, I believed it. Consciousness returned to me in slow, confusing waves. The first thing I registered was the silence. In my apartment in the Bronx, silence was a luxury I couldn't afford. There was always the sound of sirens wailing down the street, the heavy thud of footsteps from the neighbors upstairs, or the terrifying, unpredictable noises Brad made when he was drunk in the living room. But here, the silence was absolute. It felt thick and heavy, like a velvet blanket wrapped around the world. The second thing was the softness. I was lying on something that felt like a cloud. The sheets against my skin were cool and smooth, smelling faintly of lavender and starch, the kind of expensive, clean scent that you only found in high-end hotels or in the homes of people who never had to worry about the cost of a laundromat. I opened my eyes, blinking against the soft, amber light filtering through heavy curtains. Panic flared in my chest instantly. This wasn't my room. This wasn't my peeling ceiling with the water stain shaped like a map of Florida. This was a ceiling that soared 12 feet high, painted a creamy white and bordered with intricate crown molding. A chandelier that looked like a constellation of captured stars hung from the center, unlit but glittering in the morning light. I sat up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was in a bed that was easily 3 times the size of my own, piled high with pillows in shades of ivory and slate blue. The room was massive, filled with furniture that looked heavy and antique, a mahogany dresser, a velvet armchair by the window, a fireplace with a marble mantel. Where was I? Memories of the night before crashed into me like a physical blow. The subway, the exhaustion, the fall, the stranger with the dark eyes and the arms that felt like steel. Alessandro Raldi. Or was it Dominic? My mind scrambled for the name he had given me in the car, but it was lost in the fog. I looked down at myself. I wasn't wearing my damp scrubs anymore. I was dressed in an oversized t-shirt, soft and gray, that smelled like him, cedar and musk. I pulled the collar of the shirt away from my neck, checking my skin. My arm, the one Brad had used as a stress ball, was carefully bandaged. Someone had applied a cooling gel to the bruises and wrapped them in professional-grade gauze. The door opened. I scrambled back against the headboard, pulling the duvet up to my chin. The man from the subway walked in. In the harsh, fluorescent light of the train, he had looked dangerous. Here, in the soft morning light of this palace, he looked devastating. He had discarded his suit jacket. He was wearing black trousers and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that were corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. He was carrying a silver tray. He stopped when he saw I was awake. His expression didn't change much. It was still that guarded, impenetrable mask I remembered, but his shoulders seemed to relax. Just a fraction. He didn't say a cheerful good morning. He didn't ask how I slept. He simply walked over to the nightstand and set the tray down with a deliberate, careful movement. The smell of food hit me, and my stomach gave a traitorous growl that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. On the tray was a bowl of steaming tomato soup, a plate of grilled cheese sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, and a pot of tea. He pulled the velvet armchair closer to the bed and sat down, crossing one leg over the other. He watched me with those dark, unreadable eyes. I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a rusty croak. I cleared my throat and tried again. I asked him where I was. He answered simply. He told me I was in his home. He said I had been unconscious for 14 hours. 14 hours. The panic that had been simmering in my gut boiled over. I threw the covers off, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. I told him I had to go. I told him I had missed my shift. I told him, Brad. I stopped myself before saying the name, choking on it. I just said I had to leave. I tried to stand, but my legs were still weak, trembling under my weight. The room spun lazily. He didn't move to stop me physically. He didn't grab me or push me back down. He just sat there, watching me struggle to find my balance. And he spoke. He told me that nobody was looking for me. I froze. I looked at him, confused. He explained, his voice calm and level, that he had taken the liberty of accessing my phone while I slept. He had texted my supervisor at the hospital, telling her I had a family emergency and would be out for a few days. He had texted the contact listed as Brad, telling him I was picking up extra shifts and staying at a friend's place near the hospital to save money on the commute. My blood ran cold. He had touched my phone. He had texted Brad. I stared at him, horror washing over me. I asked him if he had any idea what he had done. I told him Brad wouldn't believe a text. I told him Brad would come looking for me at the hospital. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The movement brought him closer, invading my personal space, but not in a way that felt threatening. It felt intense. He told me that Brad wouldn't come looking. He said it with such absolute certainty that I almost believed him. He said that men like Brad were lazy predators. As long as they thought their property was safe and working to bring them money, they didn't exert themselves. Property. The word hung in the air between us. He had used the exact word that my life felt like. I wasn't a girlfriend. I wasn't a partner. I was an asset. A punching bag that paid half the rent. I asked him who he was. I asked him why he was doing this. Why he had brought a stranger into his home, bandaged her arm, and lied to her boyfriend. He didn't answer immediately. He reached for the teapot and poured a cup, the china clinking softly in the silence. He added a spoonful of honey, his movements precise and elegant, at odds with the sheer size of his hands. He handed me the cup. He didn't force it on me. He just held it out, waiting. I took it. The warmth seeped into my cold fingers. I took a sip. Chamomile, sweet and hot. He finally spoke. He told me his name was Dominic, and then he told me that he hadn't brought a stranger into his home. He said he had brought a mirror. I frowned, not understanding. He sat back, his gaze drifting past me to the window, looking out at the skyline of Manhattan that stretched out like a jagged jaw of steel and glass. His face softened, the hard lines around his mouth easing into something that looked like sorrow. He began to speak, not to me, but to the room. He told me about a woman he used to know, a woman who was beautiful and kind, who could make a garden grow out of concrete, a woman who wore long sleeves in the summer to hide the marks on her arms. He described the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs that used to make her flinch. He described the way she would smile at the neighbors with a split lip and tell them she had walked into a door. He described a boy, a helpless, angry boy, who used to hide under the kitchen table and listen to the sounds of his mother breaking, unable to do anything to stop it because he was too small, too weak. He turned his gaze back to me. His eyes were shining with unshed tears, dark pools of ancient pain. He told me that the boy had sworn an oath over his mother's casket. He had promised that if he ever had the power, he would never let another woman suffer what she had suffered. He told me he hadn't been strong enough to save her then, but he was strong enough now. He gestured to my arm, the one hidden under the bandage. He told me that when he saw those marks on the subway, he didn't see a stranger. He saw his mother, and he saw the failure that had haunted him for 30 years. I sat there, the teacup trembling in my hands. The story had stripped away the fear, leaving me raw and exposed. This wasn't a kidnapping. This wasn't a rich man playing games. This was a rescue mission born from a graveyard. He looked me in the eye, his expression fierce and imploring. He told me he wasn't asking me to stay forever. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He was asking for a chance to balance the scales. He asked me to stay until the bruises faded, just until I was strong enough to stand without shaking. I looked around the room, the gilded cage that offered safety. Then I thought about the apartment in the Bronx, the smell of stale beer, the sound of Brad's voice when he was looking for a fight. I whispered that I couldn't pay him. I told him I had $42 to my name. He almost smiled then. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it transformed his face. He told me that money was the one thing in this world he had in excess. He told me that my safety was the only currency he was interested in. He pointed to the soup. He told me to eat. I picked up the spoon. The first mouthful of soup was rich and creamy, tasting of roasted tomatoes and basil. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until that moment. I ate quickly, forgetting my manners, forgetting the stranger watching me. I devoured the sandwich, the soup, the tea. When I was finished, I felt a heavy, warm lethargy settle over me. The food, the warmth, the emotional release, it was all pulling me back toward sleep. Dominic stood up. He took the tray from my lap. He told me to rest. He said Lucia, his housekeeper, would bring me some clothes later. He told me the door locked from the inside if it would make me feel safer. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. He didn't look back, but he spoke one last thing. He told me that I wasn't alone anymore. He said those words like a vow, heavy and permanent. Then he closed the door, leaving me in the silence. I stared at the heavy wooden door. I should have locked it. I should have been planning my escape. But instead, I slid back down under the covers, pulling the duvet up over my head. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't listening for footsteps. I wasn't waiting for the shouting to start. I closed my eyes, and sleep claimed me instantly, deep and dreamless and safe. 3 weeks. They say it takes 21 days to form a new habit, to rewire the neural pathways in your brain to accept a new reality. For the first 21 days of my stay with Dominic, I waited for the other shoe to drop. I waited for the shouting, for the demands, for the sudden shift in atmosphere that meant I had done something wrong. But the shoe never dropped. Instead, a routine emerged, soft and steady as a heartbeat. I went back to work 3 days after waking up in the penthouse. I had tried to argue that I could take the subway, that I knew how to be careful. Dominic hadn't even looked up from his espresso. He simply stated that I would never step foot on a subway platform alone again, as long as I was under his roof. It wasn't a request. It was a fact of physics, like gravity. So, every morning at 6:30, a black sedan waited at the curb. Silas, the mountain of a man who had been at the train station that first night, was my driver. Silas didn't talk much. In fact, for the first week, I wasn't sure he could speak at all. He communicated in nods and grunts, and the terrifying way he scanned the street before unlocking the car doors. But I noticed things. I noticed how he adjusted the rearview mirror to keep me in sight, not to ogle, but to ensure I was still breathing. I noticed how he kept the temperature exactly where I liked it, 72 degrees, without me ever asking. At the hospital, the changes in me were impossible to miss. My scrubs didn't hang off my frame like scarecrow clothes anymore. My skin had lost that translucent, sickly gray pallor, replaced by a hint of color. I was eating 3 meals a day, prepared by Lucia, Dominic's housekeeper, who treated feeding me like a personal crusade against the world's injustices. She packed my lunches in glass containers, roasted chicken with rosemary, risottos that were still warm in their thermal bags, fresh fruit that cost more than my hourly wage. The other nurses whispered. They asked if I had met someone. They said I was glowing. I told them I was just sleeping better. It wasn't a lie. For the first time in 3 years, I slept through the night. I didn't wake up at the sound of a car backfiring. I didn't lie awake staring at the door handle, praying it wouldn't turn. But the real transformation happened in the evenings. Coming home to the penthouse felt surreal every single time the elevator doors opened directly into the foyer. But it was what happened inside those walls that started to knit the raveled edges of my soul back together. Dominic was usually there. He worked from home often, managing an empire of shipping logistics, real estate, and investments that I politely didn't ask about. But when the clock struck 7 in the evening, he put the phone away. He closed the laptop. We started cooking together. It began by accident. I had walked into the kitchen one evening to find him staring at a pile of vegetables with an expression of profound perplexity. He was a man who could negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts without blinking, but apparently, a butternut squash was his kryptonite. I had laughed. It was the first time I had genuinely laughed in years. A rusty, foreign sound that surprised us both. I took the knife from his hand and showed him how to peel the tough skin. After that night, it became our ritual. I discovered that Dominic Raldi, the terrifying figure who commanded armies of men, was helpless against onions. We were making a sauce one Tuesday, and I looked over to see tears streaming down his stoic face. He looked furious, glaring at the chopped white onions as if they had personally insulted his ancestors. He muttered that it was a chemical weapon and should be banned by the Geneva Convention. I handed him a paper towel, fighting back a smile, and told him that even monsters had weaknesses. He had looked at me then, his wet eyes narrowing playfully, and told me that I was dangerous because I knew his secrets. That domesticity was a drug. It was addictive. We watched movies in his media room, a space with a screen larger than the cinema in my old neighborhood. I introduced him to the world of romantic comedies, a genre he claimed to despise, but watched with an intensity that suggested he was analyzing them for tactical errors. During one particularly cheesy film where the protagonist runs through an airport security checkpoint to stop the love of his life, Dominic scoffed. He gestured at the screen with his wine glass and launched into a 5-minute monologue about the inefficiency of the airport security and how the protagonist would have been tackled by 3 federal agents before he reached the gate. He called it a security breach, not a romantic gesture. I argued that he was missing the point. I told him it was about the desperation of love, about risking everything for the one person who mattered. He fell silent then. He looked at me in the dim light of the projector, the flickering colors of the movie reflecting in his dark eyes. He said quietly that he understood the desperation. He said that if it were him, he wouldn't run through the airport. He would buy the airline and ground the plane. It was a joke, mostly. But the way he said it, with that absolute, unshakable confidence, made my breath hitch. I realized then that I wasn't just safe with him. I was falling for him. I was falling for the way he remembered that I hated cilantro. I was falling for the way he listened when I talked about my patients, giving my small stories the same weight he gave his business deals. I was falling for the man who was teaching me that I took up space in the world, and that was okay. But gravity always wins. And the higher you climb, the harder the fall. It happened on a rainy Thursday, almost a month into my stay. The weather had turned violent, thunder rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. I was reading in the living room, curled up under a cashmere throw, waiting for Dominic to finish a late conference call. I realized I had left my phone in the kitchen, near the back of the apartment, where his study was located. I walked down the hallway, my socks silent on the plush runner rugs. The door to his study was cracked open just an inch. I heard his voice before I saw him, and I froze. The warm, teasing baritone I had grown used to over pasta and wine was gone. In its place was a voice made of crushed glass and ice. He was speaking Italian, rapid and clipped, the vowels sharp enough to cut. I didn't speak Italian fluently, but I knew enough words from my grandmother to understand the tone. And I understood the few English words that were woven into the deadly tapestry of his sentences. Example, message, permanent. He wasn't discussing shipping containers. He wasn't negotiating a lease. I crept closer, against every instinct screaming at me to run. Through the sliver of the door, I saw him. He was standing behind his massive oak desk, one hand braced on the wood, the knuckles white, the other hand held the phone to his ear. His face was a mask of cold fury, devoid of any humanity. It was the face of the man who had looked at my bruises on the subway, but magnified 1,000 times. He said something low. He told the person on the other end to make sure nobody found the body for 3 days. He said he wanted the message to be clear. Body. The word hit me like a physical slap. The air left my lungs. I stepped back, my heart thundering so loud I was sure he could hear it over the storm outside. But I bumped into a small side table. A decorative vase wobbled. I caught it before it fell, but the sound of ceramic shifting on wood was distinct in the sudden silence of the hallway. Dominic stopped talking abruptly. He didn't say goodbye. He just hung up the phone. Come in, Clara. His voice wasn't raised. It was flat, resigned. He knew I was there. He always knew. I pushed the door open with a trembling hand. He was standing exactly where I had seen him, but his face had changed. The lethal mask was gone, replaced by a guarded wariness. He looked like a man bracing for a blow. He looked at me, and then he looked down at his hands, as if checking them for blood. I stood in the doorway, hugging my arms around myself. The domestic bubble we had built over the last 3 weeks popped, leaving me shivering in the cold reality of who he was. He wasn't just Dominic who cried chopping onions. He was Dominic Raldi, a man who ordered death over the phone while the pasta water boiled. He spoke first. He told me I shouldn't have heard that. He told me that I should go back to the living room, pack a bag, and tell Silas to take me to a hotel. I asked him why. My voice was barely a whisper. He looked up then, and the anguish in his eyes was terrible to witness. He told me that he was a bad man. He said he had tried to be someone else for me, tried to play house, tried to pretend that his hands weren't stained. But the truth always came out. He told me he was a monster, and monsters destroy everything they touch. He said he didn't want to destroy me. He walked around the desk, stopping a few feet away from me. He kept his distance, as if he were contagious. He told me to leave. He said he would pay for the hotel, pay for a new apartment, pay for whatever I needed. But I had to go before I saw something I couldn't unsee. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the ruthlessness, yes. I saw the capacity for violence that rolled off him in waves. But I also saw the man who had caught me when I fell. I saw the man who had lied to my abuser to buy me time. I saw the man who had fed me when I was starving and asked for nothing in return. I realized something in that moment, standing on the precipice of his darkness. I realized that the world was full of monsters. Brad was a monster, a petty, cruel, weak monster who hurt people to feel big. Dominic was a monster too, but he was the kind of monster who stood at the gate and kept the other wolves away. He was my monster. I took a step forward. He flinched, actually flinched, as if I had raised a hand to him. He warned me to stop. He told me not to come closer. I took another step. I told him that I didn't want a hotel. I told him that I knew what he was. I had known since the subway. Normal men didn't have bodyguards. Normal men didn't make fear vanish from a room just by walking into it. I told him I didn't care about his business. I didn't care about the phone call. I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were rigid, resisting my touch. I told him that the only thing I cared about was how he treated me. And he had treated me with more reverence in 3 weeks than the rest of the world had in 26 years. He stared at our joined hands, as if he couldn't comprehend why I wasn't running. He whispered that I should be terrified of him. I looked up into his dark eyes and told him the truth. I told him that for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. Not of him. Something in him broke then. The tension that held his shoulders rigid snapped. He let out a ragged breath, a sound of surrender. He pulled me to him. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. His arms wrapped around me like bands of iron, burying his face in the crook of my neck. He inhaled sharply, breathing me in like I was oxygen and he had been suffocating. He kissed me. It wasn't like the movies. It wasn't polite or choreographed. It was raw. It tasted of desperation and confession. His mouth moved against mine with a hunger that should have frightened me. But instead, it lit a fire in my blood. I kissed him back, pouring all my gratitude, all my confusion, all my growing love into the contact. He lifted me up, just like he had on the subway. But this time I wrapped my legs around his waist, pulling him closer. He carried me out of the study, away from the desk and the phone and the orders of death, and down the hall to his bedroom. The room was dark, lit only by the flashes of lightning outside. He set me down on the bed, the massive bed I had woken up in alone so many times. He hesitated. He hovered over me, his hands trembling slightly as they framed my face. He asked me if I was sure. He told me that if we did this, there was no going back. He said he wouldn't let me go once he had me. I reached up and traced the sharp line of his jaw. I told him I didn't want to go back. I told him I was exactly where I belonged. What followed was a revelation. I had been with Brad. I knew what sex was, something transactional, something taken, something that left me feeling used and empty. This was not that. Dominic touched me as if I were made of spun glass. For a man so big, for a man who could order a hit without blinking, his hands were agonizingly gentle. He worshipped every inch of me. He traced the scars on my soul with his lips. He asked for permission with every shift of his weight, his eyes never leaving mine, checking, always checking. When he finally entered me, it wasn't a conquest, it was a homecoming. Tears leaked from the corners of my eyes, sliding into my hair. He kissed them away, murmuring in Italian soft prayer-like words that felt like blessings against my skin. Mia, only mine, beautiful. We lay together afterwards in the tangled sheets, the storm outside beginning to fade into a steady, rhythmic rain. My head rested on his chest, right over his heart. I listened to the steady, powerful thrum of it. He ran his fingers through my hair, a repetitive, soothing motion. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the things we had silently agreed to. I had accepted the beast. I had walked into the lion's den and lay down beside him. But as I drifted toward sleep, lulled by his heartbeat, a small, cold thought pricked at the back of my mind. We had created a sanctuary in this penthouse. We had built a fortress of sheets and whispers, but the world outside hadn't vanished. Brad was still out there. And secrets, no matter how deeply buried or powerfully guarded, had a way of clawing their way to the surface. I tightened my arm across Dominic's chest, holding on. I was safe for tonight, and tonight would have to be enough. They say that peace is fragile, like a soap bubble floating on the wind. It catches the light, swirling with beautiful, iridescent colors, looking solid and real for a moment. But all it takes is a single sharp point to make it vanish as if it never existed. For 30 days, I had lived inside that bubble. I had let myself believe in the solidity of the walls Dominic had built around me. I had let myself forget, but the ghost was never really gone. He was just waiting in the wings. It happened on a Tuesday, a mundane, gray Tuesday that felt like every other day. I was at the nurse's station at the clinic, updating a patient's chart. The smell of antiseptic and coffee hung in the air, familiar and grounding. I was laughing at something another nurse, Sarah, was saying about her cat. I felt normal. I felt safe. Then the elevator doors dinged at the end of the hall. It was a sound I heard 100 times a day. But this time, for reasons my conscious mind couldn't explain, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My body knew before my eyes did. A cold shiver violently traced its way down my spine, freezing the smile on my face. I looked up, standing at the reception desk, talking to the volunteer with a charming, easy smile, was Brad. The world didn't just stop. It tilted on its axis and threw me off. He looked exactly the same. That was the most terrifying part. He wasn't a monster with horns and claws. He was wearing the blue button-down shirt I had bought him for his birthday last year. His hair was neatly combed. He looked like a nice guy. He looked like the man who used to bring me flowers before he started bringing me bruises. He hadn't seen me yet. He was leaning over the desk, using that earnest, pleading tone I knew so well, asking the volunteer for information. I could tell by the way the older woman softened, the way she leaned in to help him, that he was spinning a story. The worried boyfriend. The frantic partner is looking for his missing love. Bile rose in my throat, hot and acidic. The pen I was holding slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the desk. The sound was small, but in my heightened state of panic, it sounded like a gunshot. Brad's head snapped up. His eyes scanned the room, and then they locked onto mine. The smile dropped from his face instantly, replaced by a look of intense, predatory satisfaction. It was the look of a hunter who had finally flushed the deer out of the brush. He took a step toward me, his mouth opening to call my name. I didn't wait to hear it. Panic, blind and primal, took over. I turned and ran. I didn't care about professionalism. I didn't care about the patients. I bolted toward the staff break room, slamming the door behind me and fumbling with the lock until it clicked home. I backed away from the door until my legs hit the counter, and then I slid down to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt too thin. I gasped, trying to fill my lungs, but my chest was a tight band of iron. He found me. He found me. My phone was in my pocket. I pulled it out with shaking hands. I didn't call 911. The police would ask questions. They would take a report. They would be slow. I called the only number that mattered. Silas picked up on the first ring. He didn't say hello. He just waited, his silence a question. I whispered that he was here. I choked out Brad's name. Silas didn't ask for details. He didn't ask if I was sure. He just said 2 words, "Stay put." 3 minutes later, I heard a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, the heavy thud of boots, and then silence. When the door to the break room opened, it wasn't Brad. It was Silas. He filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the light, blocking out the threat. He looked at me huddled on the floor, and his expression darkened. He held out a hand. He told me the car was out back. He said we were leaving. I asked about Brad. Silas simply said that he had been removed from the premises. The drive back to the penthouse was a blur of gray rain and terrified thoughts. When we arrived, Dominic was waiting in the foyer. He wasn't working. He was pacing, a caged tiger in a bespoke suit. When he saw me, he saw the terror still etched into my pale face, and the temperature in the room plummeted. He crossed the distance between us in 3 long strides and pulled me into his arms. He didn't say a word. He just held me, his hand pressing my head against his chest so I could hear the furious, rapid beating of his heart. After a long time, he pulled back. He looked into my eyes, and I saw the beast I had met in his study. The darkness was swimming on the surface now, unhidden. He told me, his voice deceptively calm, that he was going to kill him. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of intent, a logistical plan. He said he knew where Brad lived. He said it would be easy. A brake has gone wrong. A car accident. A disappearance. He said I would never have to look over my shoulder again. Part of me, the dark, scared, exhausted part, wanted to say yes. I wanted to let the monster off the leash. I wanted Brad to stop existing, but I looked at Dominic's hands. The hands that had chopped vegetables with me. The hands that had held me with such gentleness the night before. I imagined them stained with blood, not metaphorically, but literally. I imagined the toll it would take on his soul, adding another weight to the burden he already carried for his mother. I couldn't let him do it. Not for me. I grabbed his lapels. I told him no. He looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. He argued that laws were for people who played by the rules, and Brad had broken the rules the moment he put his hands on me. I insisted. I told him I wanted to try the legal way first. I wanted a restraining order. I wanted to stand in a courtroom and tell the truth. I wanted to take my power back, not just have him hand it to me wrapped in a body bag. I needed to know that I had tried to be a civilized human being, even if Brad wasn't. Dominic stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. His jaw worked as he ground his teeth. He hated it. I could see how much he hated it. It went against every instinct he possessed. Finally, he nodded. A sharp, jerky motion. He agreed to try it my way. But he added a condition. He said we would try the law once. If Brad stepped 1 inch over the line after that, the law was done, and he began. I agreed. The next week was a whirlwind of legal preparation that felt more like preparing for war. Dominic didn't hire a normal family lawyer. He hired a team of sharks in Italian suits who usually defended corporate mergers and high-profile criminal cases. They sat me down and made me recount every slap, every insult, every bruise. It was grueling. It felt like reopening a wound that had just started to scab over. Dominic sat next to me through every meeting, his hand holding mine, his silence a heavy, supportive presence. Whenever my voice shook, he would squeeze my fingers, a silent reminder that I wasn't in that apartment anymore. The day of the hearing arrived. The courthouse smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and misery. It was a place where love went to die, and anger went to be documented in triplicate. We walked into the courtroom, and I saw him. Brad was sitting at the respondent's table with a lawyer who looked like he had been hired from a strip mall advertisement. When Brad saw us, his eyes widened slightly. He took in Dominic, the expensive suit, the way he walked, the proprietary hand on the small of my back. I saw the calculation in Brad's eyes. He didn't see a protector. He saw a rival. The hearing was a farce. That was the only word for it. My lawyer presented the evidence, the photos I had secretly taken of my injuries, the hospital records, the testimony of my neighbors who had heard the screaming. It seemed overwhelming. It seemed undeniable. Then Brad took the stand. He was brilliant. I had forgotten how brilliant he could be at this. He looked at the judge, a tired-looking woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, and he wept. He didn't sob loudly. He just let a few manly, restrained tears fall. He told the judge that he loved me. He said I was unstable. He said I had been under a lot of stress at work and had started hallucinating things. He claimed the bruises were from when he tried to stop me from hurting myself. He painted a picture of a saintly boyfriend trying to save a hysterical woman. It was a lie so bold, so complete, that I felt dizzy. I looked at Dominic. He was sitting stone still, but his eyes were fixed on Brad with a look that should have made Brad spontaneously combust. The judge looked back and forth between us. She looked tired. She clearly had 20 more cases to hear before lunch. She ruled. She granted the restraining order. But she lectured us both. She called it a toxic domestic situation and advised us to stay away from each other. She granted me 500 feet. 500 feet. That was the price of my safety. A piece of paper that said Brad had to stay the length of a city block away from me. As the gavel banged, finalizing the order, I didn't feel safe. I felt ridiculous. I held the paper in my hand, feeling how thin it was. It couldn't stop a bullet. It couldn't stop a fist. It was just paper. We walked out of the courtroom. The hallway was crowded. Dominic was talking to the lawyers, his back turned for a split second as he signed a document. I was standing near the heavy double doors, waiting. Brad appeared. He must have slipped out the side exit. He walked right up to me. He was smiling, that same charming smile he had worn at the hospital. He stopped just outside of striking distance. He looked at the paper in my hand and laughed softly. He spoke to me, his voice low and intimate, meant only for my ears. He told me that I looked good. He said the rich boyfriend clearly fed me well. I stepped back, my back hitting the wall. I told him he wasn't allowed to talk to me. I waved the paper, a useless shield. He leaned in closer, invading my space. The smell of his cologne, a cheap, musky scent I used to associate with love, made my stomach turn. He whispered. The words slid into my ear like poison. He asked if I really thought a piece of paper would stop him. He told me that I belonged to him. He said that eventually, the rich guy would get bored and throw me out, and when that happened, he would be waiting. He promised me that he had a lot of unfinished business with me. The threat paralyzed me. It was the voice from my nightmares, real and present in the middle of a courthouse. Then, the sun went out. A shadow fell over Brad, swallowing him whole. Brad looked up. He kept looking up. Dominic was standing behind him. Dominic didn't shout. He didn't shove Brad. He didn't even touch him. He just stood there, radiating a menace so palpable it felt like the air pressure had dropped. He looked like a monolith, a force of nature dressed in charcoal wool. Brad's smile faltered. He took a step back, trying to regain his bravado, but his eyes darted nervously. Dominic spoke. His voice was a low rumble, barely louder than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. He didn't address Brad by name. He didn't tell him to back off. He simply asked Brad if he liked breathing. It was such a strange, calm question. Brad stammered. He asked who the hell Dominic was. Dominic leaned down, bringing his face level with Brad's. His eyes were void of any light. He told Brad that he was facing the consequences of his actions. He told Brad to look at me. He waited until Brad's terrified eyes flicked to my face. Then Dominic delivered the message. He said that if Brad ever came within 500 miles of me, let alone 500 feet, the police wouldn't find a body to arrest. He said Brad would simply cease to exist. He described in terrifyingly graphic detail exactly how little of Brad would be left to mourn. Brad turned pale. The nice guy mask shattered completely, revealing the coward underneath. He looked from Dominic to the security guards down the hall, realizing that nobody was coming to save him because Dominic hadn't actually touched him. Brad swallowed hard. He muttered a curse word, turned on his heel, and walked away. He walked fast, almost running, disappearing into the crowd without looking back. I let out a breath that ended in a sob. Dominic turned to me immediately. The monster vanished, replaced by the protector. He touched my cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear I hadn't felt fall. He asked if I was okay. I looked at the retreating figure of Brad. Then I looked at the paper in my hand. I told him no. I told him that Brad wasn't scared of the judge. He wasn't scared of the police. I looked up at Dominic. I told him that Brad was only scared of him. We walked out of the courthouse into the blinding afternoon sun. Silas brought the car around. I climbed into the back seat, crumbling the restraining order into a ball in my fist. As we drove away, watching the city pass by, a cold realization settled in my chest, heavier than the fear. I had tried to do the right thing. I had tried to be a good citizen, but the world wasn't built for good citizens. It was built for wolves. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that the paper ball in my hand was worthless. Brad would be back. He wouldn't be able to help himself. His ego was too bruised, his obsession too deep. He would come back, and when he did, I wouldn't be calling the police. I looked at Dominic, staring out the window, his jaw set in a hard line. He was waiting. He knew it too. He was just waiting for permission to do what he was born to do. Next time, I would give it to him. 3 days. That was how long the piece of paper lasted. That was the lifespan of the legal system's protection. It was a Friday night. I had just finished my shift at the hospital, and the fatigue was a heavy, familiar coat on my shoulders. But it was a good kind of fatigue, the kind that came from doing work that mattered, not the soul-crushing exhaustion of survival mode. I said my goodbyes to the night shift nurses, checked my phone to see a message from Silas saying he was waiting at the south entrance, and headed for the elevator. The hospital parking garage was a cavernous, echoing structure of concrete and fluorescent lights that hummed with an irritating buzz. It was always cold in there, smelling of gasoline and damp dust. I usually hated it, but knowing Silas was just down the ramp made it bearable. I stepped out of the elevator vestibule, the heavy metal door clanking shut behind me. The sound echoed in the quiet garage. I took 2 steps toward the waiting black sedan, my eyes fixed on the silhouette of Silas in the driver's seat. Then, a hand shot out from behind a concrete pillar. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was a claw. Fingers dug into my upper arm, finding the exact spot where the old bruises were just starting to fade into yellow memories. The grip was punishing, familiar, and terrifying. I was yanked backward, my feet skidding on the oil-stained concrete. I opened my mouth to scream, but a hand clamped over it, smelling of stale tobacco and that cheap, cloying cologne. The voice that hissed in my ear froze the blood in my veins. Brad whispered that I was hard to catch. He sounded breathless, excited, like a child who had finally grabbed the toy he had been denied. He dragged me backward into the shadows of the pillar, away from the line of sight of the car. He pressed me against the rough concrete, his body weight pinning me there. I could feel the heat radiating off him, a feverish, manic energy. He told me to be quiet. He said if I screamed, he would make sure I regretted it right here on the pavement. He asked me if I really thought I could leave him. He told me that I belonged to him, that I was his property, and that nobody walked away from him until he was done with them. Panic, white-hot and blinding, surged through me. The restraining order was in my purse. It might as well have been a napkin for all the good it was doing me now. He was here. He was touching me. He was going to hurt me. And then he was going to drag me away, and I would disappear. But then, I remembered, I wasn't the same Clara who had cowered in the bathroom in the Bronx. I was Clara, who lived in a penthouse in the sky. I was Clara, who was loved by a monster. I didn't scream. I bit down. Hard. I sank my teeth into the meaty part of his palm, covering my mouth. I tasted the salt of his skin and the metallic tang of blood. Brad yelped, a high-pitched sound of shock and pain. He jerked his hand back instinctively. That split second was all I needed. I screamed. I screamed Silas's name with every ounce of air in my lungs. Brad raised his hand to strike me, his face twisting into a mask of ugly rage. I flinched, waiting for the blow. It never landed. There was a sound like a thunderclap, the heavy slam of a car door. Then, the sound of running footsteps, heavy and fast, closing the distance in seconds. Brad turned his head, distracted. He didn't even have time to widen his eyes. Silas hit him like a freight train. It wasn't a fight. It was physics. Mass times acceleration. Silas slammed into Brad, lifting him off his feet and driving him into the concrete pillar with a bone-jarring thud that echoed through the entire level. Brad crumbled to the ground, wheezing, the wind completely knocked out of him. I slid down the wall, my knees giving way, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. Silas didn't look at me. He stood over Brad, his gun drawn but held low, pointing directly at Brad's kneecap. He looked calm, bored even. He looked like he was taking out the trash. Then, the rear door of the sedan opened. Dominic stepped out. He didn't run. He walked. He moved with a slow, predatory grace, his dress shoes making a sharp, rhythmic click, click, click on the concrete. He was wearing a long black coat with the collar turned up against the chill. He looked like the angel of death. He walked past me, pausing only to place a hand briefly on my head, a silent check to make sure I was whole. Then he stopped in front of Brad, who was gasping for air on the dirty floor. Dominic looked down. His face was devoid of expression. It was a blank slate of terrifying neutrality. He spoke softly. He asked Brad if he knew what the number 500 meant. He asked if math was difficult for him. Brad groaned, trying to push himself up. He glared at Dominic with a mixture of fear and stubborn arrogance. He spat on the ground near Dominic's shoes. Brad rasped that this was assault. He said he would call the police. He said he just wanted to talk to his girlfriend, and we had attacked him. He smiled then, a bloody, jagged smile. He said it was just a misdemeanor violation. He said he would be out on bail by morning, and then we would do this dance again. He was right. God help me, he was right. The system was a revolving door for men like him. He would get arrested, he would post bail, and he would come back angry. Dominic didn't kick him. He didn't shoot him. He just stared at him for a long, contemplative moment. Then he turned to Silas. He told Silas to put the trash in the trunk. I gasped. Dominic turned to me. He crouched down, bringing his face level with mine. He took my freezing hands in his warm ones. He told me we were going home. He said it was over. I asked him what he was going to do. He ignored the question. He picked me up, carrying me to the car, and settled me in the back seat. Silas deposited a groaning, zip-tied Brad into the trunk of the SUV, not the sedan we usually took, I realized, but the larger security vehicle that had been trailing us. The drive back to the penthouse was silent. I sat shivering, despite the heat blasting from the vents. My mind was racing. I knew what happened in movies. I knew what happened in the stories people whispered about men like Dominic. They went to the docks. They went to the marshes in New Jersey. They dug holes. I thought I would feel guilty. I thought I would feel horror at the idea of a human life being extinguished, even a life as rotten as Brad's. But as I watched the city lights blur past, all I felt was a cold, hard knot of exhaustion. I was tired of being afraid. I was tired of the law failing me. I was tired of looking over my shoulder. We arrived at the building. Silas took the car and its cargo down to the private garage. Dominic took me up to the penthouse. He poured me a glass of brandy. My hands shook so hard I spilled a little on the counter. He wiped it up without a word. He stood across the kitchen island from me, watching me. He was waiting. I took a sip of the burning liquid. It grounded me. I set the glass down. I looked him in the eye. I told him to do it. The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. I told him that I couldn't live like this anymore. I told him that Brad was right, he would be out on bail by morning. I told him that the law was a shield made of paper, and I needed a shield made of steel. I told him I didn't want to know the details. I just wanted to know that he was gone. I wanted to wake up tomorrow and know that the monster wasn't coming back. I gave him permission to be the bad guy. I gave him permission to be the beast. Dominic watched me, his dark eyes searching my soul. He looked for hesitation. He looked for regret. He found none. He nodded slowly. A look of profound sadness crossed his face, not for Brad, but for me, for the loss of innocence that the request represented. He walked over to a leather satchel he had left on the counter earlier. He opened it, but he didn't pull out a gun. He didn't pull out a knife or a garrote wire. He pulled out a laptop and a thick manila folder. I blinked, confused. He set the folder down in front of me. He opened it. It was filled with bank statements, tax returns, emails, construction invoices. He began to speak, his voice calm and professorial. He told me that violence was a crude tool. He said that killing a man was messy, it drew attention, and it ended his suffering too quickly. He said that true punishment wasn't death. It was the complete and total erasure of a life, while the person was still alive to watch it happen. He explained that while I had been fighting for a restraining order, his forensic accountants had been fighting a different war. He pointed to a highlighted figure on a bank statement. He told me that Brad worked as a foreman for a mid-sized construction firm in Queens. He explained that Brad had been skimming off the top of supply orders for 5 years. He had been ordering high-grade copper wiring, selling it on the black market, and installing subpar materials in residential buildings. Dominic flipped the page. He showed me the tax returns, or rather, the lack of them. Brad hadn't declared any of this illegal income. He had moved money through accounts that Dominic's team had traced back to him with embarrassing ease. Then, Dominic dropped the real bomb. He told me that one of the buildings Brad had used subpar materials on was a government-contracted housing project. That made his theft a federal crime. It was a fraud against the United States government. Dominic looked at me, a small, cold smile playing on his lips. He told me that he didn't need to kill Brad. He said that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was going to do something much worse. They were going to bury him. He checked his watch. He said the timing should be just about right. He pulled his phone out and dialed a number. He put it on speaker. Silas's voice came through, accompanied by the sound of wind and distant sirens. Silas reported that the package had been dropped off at the designated location. He said the anonymous tip had been verified. He said the welcoming committee was arriving now. Dominic walked to the living room and turned on the large television. He switched it to the local news channel. We watched in silence. 10 minutes later, the breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. FBI raid in Queens. The camera shook as the helicopter footage zoomed in on a warehouse district, the place Silas must have dumped Brad. I saw police cars. I saw black SUVs with flashing blue lights. I saw agents in windbreakers with those 3 terrifying letters printed on the back in yellow. FBI. And then, I saw him. Brad was being led out of the warehouse. He wasn't arrogant anymore. He looked small. He was handcuffed, his head bowed, surrounded by federal agents. He wasn't being arrested for a domestic dispute. He wasn't being arrested for a misdemeanor violation of a restraining order. He was being arrested for wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Dominic stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. He whispered the verdict in my ear. He told me that federal sentencing guidelines for the amount of money Brad stole, combined with the safety violations, would carry a mandatory minimum sentence. He calculated it softly. He said 15 years. He told me Brad would go to a federal penitentiary. He said there was no parole in the federal system. You served 85% of your time. 15 years. I stared at the screen, watching the man who had tormented me for 3 years get shoved into the back of a federal vehicle. He wasn't dead, but his life was over. He would lose his job, his reputation, his freedom. He would spend the next decade and a half in a cage, surrounded by men who were much, much harder than he was. Dominic tightened his hold on me. He told me that was true justice. He said death was an escape. Prison was a reckoning. I felt a sob build in my chest, but when it came out, it sounded like a laugh. A hysterical, broken, relieved laugh. The weight that had been pressing down on my lungs for years simply vanished. The phantom hands around my throat let go. I turned in Dominic's arms and buried my face in his chest. I didn't cry for Brad. I didn't cry for the past. I cried because for the first time, the future was a blank page. I whispered, "Thank you." I whispered it over and over again into his shirt. He held me tight, his hand stroking my hair. He told me I was free. And as I watched the convoy of police cars drive away on the screen, taking my nightmare with them, I finally believed him. The monster was gone, and the man holding me, the dangerous, brilliant, ruthless man holding me, was the only one I would ever need. 8 months. That was how much time had passed since the night the flashing lights of the federal convoy took my nightmare away. 8 months of waking up without a gasp in my throat. 8 months of walking down the street without scanning the reflections in shop windows to see if I was being followed. Brad had pleaded guilty. Confronted with the mountain of evidence, Dominic's team had unearthed the wire transfers, the fake invoices, the tax evasion. His cheap lawyer had advised him to take a deal. The federal judge, a man with a reputation for detesting white-collar crime that endangered public safety, had sentenced him to 15 years in a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. 15 years. I had looked at the calendar the day the news came. I would be 41 years old when he got out. I would be a different person. I would have lived an entire lifetime in the span of his incarceration, and I had already started living it. My life with Dominic had settled into a rhythm that felt less like a fairy tale and more like a partnership. I wasn't just the bird he had rescued and kept in a gilded cage anymore. I was finding my own wings. With Dominic's support, and after many late-night arguments where I insisted on paying my own way as much as possible, I had gone back to school. I was finishing my specialized certification in pediatric nursing. I wanted to work with children, specifically those who came from the kind of broken, terrifying homes I understood too well. I wanted to be the person who saw the bruises and didn't look away. Silas still drove me to my classes, but the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't just my bodyguard, he was my confidant. We had a silent understanding. He would buy me the bad gas station coffee I secretly loved, and I would pretend not to notice when he slipped an extra $20 bill into the tip jar at the diner we stopped at. But tonight, school was forgotten. Tonight was about stepping fully into Dominic's world. He had told me a week ago to keep Friday night open. He had said there was a dinner, a very important dinner. He hadn't given me details, but I knew what it meant. I had met Lucia, I had met Silas, but I hadn't met the family. Not the blood family, which Dominic didn't have, but the inner circle. The men who ran the empire alongside him. The men who made the gears turn in the shadows. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bedroom, smoothing down the front of my dress. It was emerald green silk, a color Dominic had chosen because he said it made my eyes look like dangerous jewels. It was elegant, understated, and expensive, a far cry from the scrubs and worn-out jeans that used to make up my entire wardrobe. Dominic walked in behind me. He was wearing a tuxedo, looking so handsome it made my breath hitch in my throat. He didn't say a word. He just came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder, our eyes meeting in the glass. He told me I looked regal. He said I looked like a queen. I turned in his arms, feeling a flutter of nervousness in my stomach. I confessed that I was terrified. I asked him what if they didn't like me? What if they saw me as a liability? A weakness? The nurse he picked up off the subway floor? Dominic's expression hardened, just for a second. He took my face in his hands. He told me that nobody who sat at his table would dare to disrespect me. But more importantly, he said they would respect me because I was the only person on earth who could bring him to his knees. He said I wasn't a liability. I was his balance. We took the car into the city, heading toward a restaurant in Tribeca that didn't have a sign out front, just a heavy steel door and a bouncer who nodded respectfully as we approached. The private dining room was located in the back, behind velvet curtains. A long table was set with white linens and crystal. Seated around it were 6 men and 3 women. When we walked in, the room went silent. Every person at that table stood up. I recognized a few faces from the news business tycoons, a union leader, men who supposedly ran legitimate empires, But seeing them here, in this room, with the deferential way they looked at Dominic, I knew the truth. These were the lieutenants. These were the wolves. Dominic introduced me simply. He didn't call me his girlfriend. He didn't call me his friend. He introduced me as Clara. He said I was the woman who held his heart. The dinner was an ordeal of 5 courses and intense scrutiny. I was seated next to a man named Vincent, who looked like a grandfather but had eyes as cold as a shark. He asked me about my work. He asked me if I found it difficult to deal with pain every day. I realized he was testing me. He wanted to know if I was fragile. I looked him in the eye and took a sip of my wine. I told him that pain was just a signal. It was the body's way of saying something was wrong. I told him I didn't fear pain. I feared the silence of ignoring it. I told him about a shift where I held a 6-year-old boy's hand while they set his broken bone, and how I had to be strong so he wouldn't be scared. Vincent stared at me for a long moment. Then, a slow smile spread across his face. He nodded. He raised his glass to me. He told Dominic that he had chosen well. He said I had steel in my spine. By the time dessert arrived, the atmosphere had shifted. The tension dissipated. The women, wives, and partners of the men included me in their conversation, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. I realized that these people, despite their terrifying reputations, were fiercely loyal. They protected their own. And tonight, I had been stamped with their seal of approval. I was one of them. On the drive home, I fell asleep against Dominic's shoulder, exhausted but content. I had walked into the lion's den, and I hadn't been eaten. I had been welcomed. A month later, Dominic suggested a weekend away at the country house. It was a sprawling estate in upstate New York that he used when he needed to disconnect from the noise of the city. It was late October. The trees were on fire with autumn colors: burnt orange, deep crimson, brilliant gold. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. On Saturday evening, we went for a walk in the gardens behind the main house. It was twilight, the sky painted in shades of violet and indigo. Dominic was quiet, unusually so. He held my hand tightly, his thumb tracing the back of my knuckles in a soothing rhythm. We stopped by an old stone fountain. The water bubbled softly, the only sound in the quiet evening. Dominic turned to face me. He looked nervous. It was such a rare expression on his face that I felt a sudden spike of alarm. I asked him what was wrong. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, velvet box. My heart stopped. Then it started again, beating double time. He didn't kneel. That wasn't Dominic's style. He stood tall, looking me straight in the eye, treating me as an equal. He opened the box. Inside wasn't a diamond. It was an emerald, a square-cut, deep green stone that seemed to glow in the fading light, surrounded by a halo of tiny antique diamonds. It was breathtaking. He spoke, his voice rough with emotion. He told me that this wasn't a marriage proposal. Not yet. He said he knew I was still healing. He knew I was still finding out who Clara was when she wasn't defining herself by her trauma. He said he never wanted to rush me or bind me before I was ready. He took the ring out of the box. He said this was a promise. He promised to stand between me and the world every single day. He promised that as long as he had breath in his lungs, I would never be cold, or hungry, or afraid again. He promised to be the man I deserved, even on the days he felt like the monster I needed. He asked if I would accept his promise. Tears blurred my vision, hot and fast. I looked at the man who had pulled me out of the darkness. I looked at the man who had destroyed my enemies and then stood back to let me grow. I whispered yes. I told him his promise was the only thing I wanted. He slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. He kissed my hand, then he pulled me close and kissed my lips, sealing the vow in the autumn air. Life moved forward. The ring on my finger was a constant reminder of my safety. I finished my classes. I started working at a new clinic, one funded by a mysterious, anonymous donor that I suspected was Dominic. Then came November, the anniversary. It had been exactly 1 year since that night on the subway. I had been feeling off for a few weeks, tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Certain smells made my stomach turn. I had chalked it up to stress, to the changing seasons, to the lingering ghost of my old life. But then I looked at the calendar. I did the math. I sat on the edge of the bathtub in the master suite, holding a plastic stick in my shaking hand. 2 pink lines. Clear, unmistakable. I sat there for a long time, just breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. A baby. I thought about my old life. If this had happened with Brad, it would have been a tragedy. It would have been a sentence to a lifetime of fear, trying to protect a child from its own father. But now, I touched my stomach. I imagined a child with Dominic's dark eyes. I imagined a little boy or girl who would never know what it sounded like to hear their mother scream in pain. I imagined a child who would grow up thinking that strength meant protection, not control. Joy, bright and overwhelming, washed over me. I knew how I wanted to tell him. When Dominic came home that evening, I was waiting by the door in my coat. I told him I wanted to go for a walk. I told him I wanted to go somewhere specific. He looked concerned, checking the time, checking the weather. But he saw the determination in my eyes, so he nodded. He signaled for Silas. I gave Silas the address. When we pulled up to the subway station entrance, Dominic went still. He looked out the window at the familiar grimy stairs leading underground. He looked at me, confusion warring with concern. He asked why we were here. I took his hand. I told him I needed to overwrite the memory. I told him I wanted to stand there and feel safe. Silas stayed by the car, alert but giving us space. Dominic and I walked down the stairs. It was late, but not as late as that night a year ago. The station was busy, but not crowded. The smell was the same ozone and damp dust, but it didn't smell like despair to me anymore. It smelled like a beginning. We walked to the spot. I remembered exactly where it was. The soot-stained pillar. The overhead rail where my hand had slipped. We stood there as a train rushed in, the wind whipping my hair around my face. The noise was deafening, but I didn't flinch. Dominic's arm was around my waist, a band of steel. I leaned into him. When the train pulled away, leaving silence in its wake, I turned to him. I looked at his face, the harsh lines, the guarded eyes that softened only for me. I told him that a year ago, I fell right here. I told him that I thought it was the end of my life. He nodded slowly, remembering. He said he was glad he was there to catch me. I placed his hand on my stomach, over the wool of my coat. I told him that he caught us then. And now, he was going to catch us again. He frowned, looking at his hand, then at my face. He didn't understand, not for a second. Then, realization dawned. His eyes widened, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. The formidable, articulate, terrifying Dominic Raldi was speechless. He looked down at my stomach, his hand trembling slightly. Then he looked back at me, and I saw tears standing in his eyes. He whispered the question, "A baby?" I nodded, tears slipping down my own cheeks. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He pulled me into his arms, burying his face in my neck, holding me so tight I could barely breathe. But I didn't mind. I wanted to be held. He kissed my hair, my cheek, my lips. He kept repeating it, over and over, like a prayer. A family. We're making a family. People on the platform were staring. A well-dressed couple crying in a subway station was a strange sight, even for New York. But I didn't care. I looked around at the dirty tiles, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the graffiti on the walls. This was where I had hit rock bottom. This was where I had almost died of exhaustion and sorrow. But standing there now, with my husband's promise ring on my finger and his child growing inside me, I knew the truth. This wasn't the place where I fell. This was the place where I landed. The sun came up over Central Park this morning in a wash of pale pink and gold, the kind of light that makes the city look like it's holding its breath. I sat in the armchair by the nursery window, watching the beams of light travel across the floorboards. In my arms, Leo was sleeping. He is 4 months old today. He has my nose, stubborn and slightly upturned, but he has Dominic's dark, serious eyes. Even in his sleep, he looks contemplative, his tiny hand gripping the fabric of my robe with a strength that surprises me. The house was quiet. Dominic had left early for a meeting, pressing a kiss to my forehead and another to Leo's soft cheek before disappearing into the hallway. But the silence didn't scare me anymore. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a cage. It was the peaceful silence of a life that is full, a momentary pause in a melody that is rich and sweet. I looked down at my son. I traced the curve of his ear with my finger. It's strange how memory works. Sometimes, when the rain hits the window pane just right, I can still feel the cold dampness of that subway station. I can still smell the ozone and the fear. I can still feel the phantom ache of an empty stomach and the crushing weight of hopelessness. For a long time, I thought that night was the end of my story. I thought I had failed. I thought that collapsing on a dirty train floor was the ultimate proof of my weakness, the final evidence that I wasn't strong enough to survive this world. But I was wrong. We grow up hearing fairy tales about knights in shining armor. We are taught to look for the hero who rides in on a white horse, who follows the rules, Who fights fair? We are taught that good and evil are black and white, easy to distinguish. But life isn't a fairy tale. It's messy. It's complicated. And sometimes, the hero doesn't wear shining armor. Sometimes, he wears a black suit tailored to hide a gun. Sometimes he doesn't fight fair because he knows the enemy never does. I used to think that strength meant never falling. I thought it meant standing tall even when your legs were shaking, swallowing your pain until it poisoned you. I thought asking for help was an admission of defeat. Dominic taught me the truth. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about who catches you when you do. It's about realizing that you don't have to carry the weight of the sky on your shoulders alone. It's about looking at the monsters in the dark, the abusers, the doubts, the fears, and realizing that you can summon a monster of your own to fight them. I looked out the window at the city waking up below us. Millions of people were down there, rushing to work, fighting their own battles. I wondered how many of them were like I used to be. How many women were checking their phones with dread? How many were wearing long sleeves to hide the truth? How many were starving themselves to save money for an escape that felt impossible? If I could speak to the woman I was 2 years ago, that terrified, exhausted nurse shivering in the rain, I would tell her to hold on. I would tell her that the darkness doesn't last forever. I would tell her that she is worth saving. And if you are listening to this, and you feel like you are standing on the edge of that subway platform, waiting for a train that never comes, please listen to me. You are not broken. You are not worthless. You are just waiting for your moment to land. Maybe your hero won't be a mafia boss with a fleet of black cars. Maybe it will be a friend who offers you a couch. Maybe it will be a stranger who hands you a flyer for a shelter. Maybe, just maybe, the hero will be you, finally deciding that you deserve better. I shifted Leo in my arms, and he let out a soft sigh, settling deeper into sleep. I am not the same woman who fainted on the 6 train. I am Clara Raldi. I am a mother. I am a wife. I am a survivor. I looked at the emerald ring on my finger, catching the morning light. It's a promise that we don't have to face the world alone. A promise that love, real love, doesn't hurt. It heals. It protects. It builds. The coffee machine beeped in the kitchen, signaling that the timer had gone off. A new day was starting. A day filled with diaper changes, study notes, and dinner plans. A normal, beautiful, extraordinary day. I stood up, holding my son close to my heart. I whispered a thank you to the universe, to the rain, to the gravity that pulled me down so I could be lifted up. If my story touched something in you today, if it gave you a spark of hope or a reminder of your own strength, I hope you'll share it. We need to tell these stories. We need to remind each other that even in the darkest corners of the city, love can find us. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, you are stronger than you know.